the November 10th, 2020 ceasefire statement at the end of that phase of the Second Karabakh War called for Russian FSB troops to operate the corridor and to provide for its security. I forgot the exact wording. That was clearly a provision that neither Azerbaijan nor Armenia wanted. It was forced on them by President Putin. And now the U.S. White House has proposed that the operation of that corridor could be conducted by a United States logistics firm. So we see Russia definitely, as you were saying, either on the retreat or being forced to move backwards with the U.S. and Europe, particularly with Armenia, Europe, strengthening its role. I don't think the U.S. Under President Trump seeks a big geopolitical role in the region. I think it's looking for business deals, and President Trump wants the Nobel Peace Prize.
Hello and welcome to Independent Armenian Media. I'm Karlo Sharashenidze and we have a special guest today, Ambassador Matthew Bryza. He is a former US ambassador to Azerbaijan and a leading expert on South Caucasus with years of experience in diplomacy, peace talks and energy issues at the US Department of State and National Security Council. So we are discussing the Armenian-Azerbaijan peace talks, this process, and the US interests in the region. Ambassador Bryza, thank you so much for your time. So today we are looking at a number of important developments in the South Caucasus, especially between Armenia and Azerbaijan, between Armenia and Russia and Azerbaijan and Russia, and also in Georgia, which remains like the key part of the South Caucasus, right? So all of this is happening like while Russian influence seems to be weakening, at least in some parts of the South Caucasus. So how do you see the overall picture? Like what's really happening in the region right now?
Well, that's first of all, thank you for having me. It's a very, very broad question, of course. So I think that in general, we see that Azerbaijan and Armenia are very close to a peace treaty. We see them trying to find a way to agree on the modalities of the Zangezur Corridor. As observers know, the November 10th, 2020 ceasefire statement at the end of that phase of the Second Karabakh War called for Russian FSB troops to operate the corridor and to provide for its security. I forgot the exact wording. That was clearly a provision that neither Azerbaijan nor Armenia wanted. It was forced on them by President Putin. And now the U.S. White House has proposed that the operation of that corridor could be conducted by a United States logistics firm. So, in other words, Russia would be completely out of that game. And I think that's causing great consternation in Moscow, as well as the heightening political tensions between Baku and Moscow that began with the shooting down of the Azal airliner by Russian air defenses last December 25th. For which President Putin never apologized or never even acknowledged culpability, which has really angered President Aliyev. So we see Russia definitely, as you were saying, either on the retreat or being forced to move backwards with the U.S. and Europe, particularly with Armenia, Europe, strengthening its role. I don't think the U.S. Under President Trump seeks a big geopolitical role in the region. I think it's looking for business deals, and President Trump wants the Nobel Peace Prize. And he hopes he can play some role in being there right at the very end, like the guy who jumps to the front of the parade at the last minute as Azerbaijan and Armenia reach a peace agreement. As for Georgia, it's in crisis. And it is no longer what it was. It is no longer a European country that is marching toward membership in the transatlantic community. It's not. It's stuck. And that is by Russia's design with of course, a lot of help from some people in Tbilisi.
Also, Bryza, you already covered almost everything I was planning to ask. So you mentioned the so-called Zangezur Corridor. So let's talk more specifically about Armenia-Azerbaijan relations. So we are now seeing efforts to end decades of conflict, and at the same time, the two countries are starting to work on economic progress and better, like the regional connectivity, right? So how did this become possible, and what does it mean for the wider region?
The corridor is long overdue, right? 5 years ago, going on 5 years ago, Presidents Aliyev and Putin and Prime Minister Pashinyan declared that all transit links are open and that there will be this corridor through Armenian territory to connect the main part of Azerbaijan with Nakhchivan. And it's taken much longer than anybody had hoped. And that's because it's taken a longer time also to negotiate the final elements of a peace treaty. But the recent acceleration of these developments, I think, was launched back in March when the leaders of Azerbaijan and Armenia announced they had finalized the text. They'd agreed on the final text of the peace treaty. There were a couple of issues left, but one is quite significant, which is Azerbaijan's insistence, understandably, that Armenia's constitution not contain a provision suggesting that maybe Karabakh is not part of Azerbaijan. On the other hand, it's very difficult for a country to amend its constitution at the behest of or a demand of another country, much less one with whom you just fought and lost a war. So Prime Minister Pashinyan is clearly committed to getting that amendment through his political system, through his parliament. It's a difficult battle. But let me put it this way. An Armenian senior diplomat told me just a week and a half ago that he'd been working on the Karabakh conflict for almost 25 years. And he said, we, meaning Armenia, we have never been this serious about peace. And in Baku, they are also saying we are very, very close. So against that backdrop, then it makes sense that there's movement on the Zangezur Corridor. But I think that the point about Russian FSB troops maybe not having a role and Russia being pushed back geostrategically, that is a result of two things. One, it is what I already mentioned, the anger of President Aliyev toward President Putin for the shoot down of the aircraft and the lack of any apology, not to mention damages. But on the Armenian side as well. It's since the Second Karabakh War, Prime Minister Pashinyan has been leading Armenia more and more towards the West, more and more towards Europe. And as we know, Armenia is going to withdraw, he said, from the Eurasian Economic Union, if it hasn't already, and the military cooperation between Armenia on one side and the US and EU on the other side has just been increasing for the past few years. So that's the context.
Yeah, right. So Prime Minister Pashinyan said Armenia might be open to a US company managing transit through the so-called Zangezur Corridor. So what kind of US presence will this be in the South Caucasus, and what will this mean, not only economically, but also for regional security?
First of all, I'll say I was really surprised to hear that proposal from the Trump administration, because the Trump administration has not shown any real interest in the conflict, although Steve Witkoff, Trump's top envoy, did visit Baku several months ago. I forgot exactly when that was, but it was never explained why he was there. And the Trump administration does not think geostrategically. It thinks about transactions, and it thinks about deals for U.S. companies. So when U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barrack, announced this proposal, it made sense to me in terms of a U.S. company would get a business deal. And the U.S. company would be able to bring calm both to Azerbaijan and Armenia, because there wouldn't be Russian security services running the corridor. But the problem is that what Ambassador Barrack announced is not really acceptable to either Armenia or Azerbaijan in terms of a U.S. company getting a 100-year lease on the corridor itself. That approach makes sense if you're a real estate developer like Donald Trump or Steve Witkoff. They think of, they want to build a building. Okay, they can either own the land, or you can't own the land of another country, so you can lease it. And from a businessman's perspective, that's smart. From a diplomatic perspective, that's not smart. It's impossible for Armenia and Azerbaijan to agree, because part of the corridor will be on Azerbaijani territory as well, to agree that their territory, after these two wars, after a peace treaty that's just right around the corner, or over the hills, as you say in Russian, that they would say, okay, well, we'll allow an American entity actually to have possession of our land. Now, you could argue, well, a lease is not the same thing as a change in the, the sovereignty of the territory, but a lease does mean less sovereignty of the country over the territory. There's no way around that. So I think what happened was that the Trump administration, it doesn't have the staff that U.S. presidents normally have to think through these proposals, to coordinate them with all the various pieces of the government, to understand where might there be some weaknesses, where might there need to be some adjustments. They didn't do that. It's just a small group of people who develop real estate and to make a fortune, and they say, well, we'll treat the corridor like a piece of real estate. And that just will not work for two countries that just fought a war over to whom this very territory belongs. I think this will get worked out, though. Whether you call it a lease or some operational agreement, that can be negotiated.
Yeah, Mr. Bryza, please correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, you see this more as a business deal rather than a political or geopolitical step from the U.S. administration, because there is this perception that when major U.S. companies are present on the ground, it also brings some kind of like political or broader security guarantees.
Yeah, I very much agree with you. You said that people in the countries, in Azerbaijan, hope that a business deal like this would bring along some U.S. security guarantee. And the Trump administration has suggested that in the case of Ukraine and the minerals deal, when President Zelensky is very, very eager for a clear U.S. statement of security support for Ukraine, and the Trump administration has said, "Well, give us this business deal to have access to your critical minerals," and that's a U.S. presence that is your security guarantee. But that's not how the world works. I mean, look at Cuba, right? I mean, in 1959 there was a revolution there. All the U.S. companies got nationalized, and a brutal regime came to power. And the U.S. has done really nothing. They tried to overthrow the Castro regime with the Bay of Pigs fiasco, but then it got the Cuban Missile Crisis after that. And for the subsequent decades, Cuba just continues operating as it has been since 1959, with the U.S. companies kicked out. So in other words, if there's a radical political change along the Zangezur Corridor, it's absolutely conceivable that the U.S. company that runs logistics would be kicked out, and there'd be a whole new security situation. To counter that pessimistic view, though, I'll say that if there is a U.S. company that's close to powerful people in Washington, that's on the ground with its personnel, earning money for a U.S. company, then presumably the Trump administration will at least pay attention to Armenia and Azerbaijan. But from my perspective, no, a business investment is in no way a security guarantee or a sign of some sort of U.S. military presence. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia, right? The Saudis nationalized U.S. oil companies as well, and there's no U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia. Maybe there will be. There's negotiations under the Abraham Accords, potentially if Saudi Arabia normalizes relations with Israel. But in that case, it would be an explicit security guarantee by the United States, and not a suggested guarantee because the U.S. has investments in the country.
What about Turkey? Like, Turkey is an important player in the South Caucasus, right? And a close ally of Azerbaijan. What impact does Turkey's involvement have on the balance of power and security in the South Caucasus, especially like considering potential U.S. presence in the so-called Zangezur Corridor?
Yeah, Turkey has a huge economy, a broad and deep industrial base. It has NATO's second largest military. It borders Armenia and Azerbaijan, as well as Georgia, but also Russia and Ukraine across the Black Sea, and as we know, Iran, Iraq, and Syria to the south. So it's an incredible piece of real estate with a huge economy and huge military. So it's consequential. Historically, Armenia has looked for protection against Turkic states, right, against Turks, and looked to Russia. But that's changing now, as we were talking about at the beginning of this interview. And it seems that President Erdogan and Prime Minister Pashinyan have developed a nice relationship. Pashinyan just visited Erdogan in Istanbul. The two leaders really seem to get along. And so that is a new dynamic. In Armenia, Turkey normalization possibility. You'll remember in 2009, the two countries signed agreements to normalize relations, and then the parliaments never ratified them. When it comes to Azerbaijan, I mean, Turkey and Azerbaijan, the cliche goes, it's one nation and two states. The two countries have a military alliance, which sounds like it's a pledge by each country to come to the aid of the other if the other is attacked militarily. So you couldn't have a closer relationship between Turkey and Azerbaijan than exists. So that's a big role for Turkey already. Turkey then is at the one end of the Zangezur Corridor. So once that corridor is built, I think we'll see significant investment in projects from Turkish businesses. It could be in transportation, natural gas pipeline, manufacturing, all along the corridor. And then also we should keep in mind that further on, so to the eastern side of the Zangezur Corridor are more Turkic states, and Turkey has created the Organization of Turkic States as a cultural and economic and political grouping that draws upon the cultural ties of the Turkic states. And so the Zangezur Corridor will be right in the middle of all that. And yeah, this is a moment of Turkey's increasing geopolitical significance, and it has a chance to play a role that President Erdogan believes Turkey can play, but many other countries don't agree. But he views Turkey as a stabilizing force that can help bring peace and prosperity and justice. And after all, the name of his political party is the Justice and Development Party.
Yeah, Ambassador Bryza, so what do you think Russia's response might be to these developments?
Russia doesn't really have the military, it seems to me, wherewithal or will to intervene militarily and go to war with Azerbaijan and Armenia. It's not going to happen. Can't do it. Doesn't have the capabilities now, number one. Number two, we're seeing a different response, though, by Russia. One is to move more troops, its claim, to Gyumri, although the Armenian government has denied that happened. And the other response is what we already talked about, the increasing tension, political tension with Azerbaijan, which, who knows, maybe that aims at creating political instability in Azerbaijan. I don't know. Or is it just this angry dispute between the two leaders? I'm not sure, but I think Russia has been turning up the tension with Azerbaijan. And one reason, I think, is in response to Russia trying to intimidate Baku as Baku moves away from Russia geopolitically.
Yeah, right. So in this context, how do you see Georgia's role in the South Caucasus today? So what kind of risks or opportunities might this shifting landscape create for Georgia?
Well, Georgia already is the existing component in the South Caucasus or the Middle Corridor, but it's less and less interesting to Europe and to the United States. It's not on the path of association with the EU. It's seen as no longer as a normal member of the transatlantic family, possibly, or even a member of the European family. Its government has said we're going to suspend this association effort. And as you've seen, the EU and US have imposed sanctions and made clear that they do not consider the current Georgian government friendly. And I think the Georgian government feels the same way. So, and there's a good possibility that Georgian citizens are going to lose their visa-free travel ability to the European Union. So Georgia is playing itself completely out of the European geopolitical game and completely into Russia's orbit. When Georgian leaders say ridiculous things like the US and the Europeans are trying to open a new front with Georgia being brought into the war, it is such an obvious lie and bit of anti-Western propaganda that the government is a puppet of Moscow, and nobody wants to deal with a government like that. It's not trusted. So who's going to invest in Georgia under those circumstances? Nobody. Georgia is on a downward spiral, and it's a country I love so deeply, and you do too. But it's hard for me to say these things, but it's so much of what you Georgians achieved is being broken, and it's very difficult to repair. It's very easy to destroy.
Okay, so this is my very last question, Ambassador Bryza. So with all those changes in the South Caucasus, so what should Washington's strategy be moving forward? And what role can or should the U.S. play in the shaping the future of the region?
In terms of a U.S. policy toward the South Caucasus, I simply believe there needs to be one. There is not one. President Trump does not have strategic vision. I mean, there are people, professionals like I used to be inside the State Department and Pentagon who, of course, want to continue with the U.S. long-standing U.S. approach to the South Caucasus, which is to encourage them to strengthen their ties to the transatlantic community, help them prosper economically, help move the natural resources to global markets, bolster democracy and political and economic freedom. That's a great overall policy, but I don't think President Trump has that view. As I was saying, he doesn't have an apparatus, a mechanism, like has always existed since the end of World War II, based around the National Security Council staff that coordinates policy ideas and makes sure that every element of the U.S. government, every ministry or every department is heard, can debate, can make its views known, can argue, and that a coordinated policy recommendation comes out that the president can either accept or change. That doesn't happen anymore, right? There is no such process. So what I criticize is that there's no systematic approach to foreign policy by the Trump administration. It's very unpredictable. And the notion of what are U.S. friends and foes is very strange for me. President Trump was clear during the election campaign saying that he will treat as a friend a country with whom the U.S. has a trade surplus, and he will treat as a foe a country with whom the U.S. has a trade deficit. That is completely different from any U.S. foreign policy approach ever. And I think it's gravely unwise. And it's not even consistent because right now, President Trump is talking about 50% tariffs on Brazil because of a political legal issue, the treatment of former President Bolsonaro. But the U.S. runs a trade surplus with Brazil. So there's just no consistency. That's what I'm critical of. It's an amateurish, haphazard, non-strategic foreign policy. And that's bad for all of us.
Ambassador Bryza, thank you so much again for your time. Thank you.
What an honor. May God bless you.